Well, good evening. Thank you all for coming out on a very cold and wet night. So we appreciate you being here. I think you'll enjoy the evening. About 47 years ago this past September, President Kennedy made a speech here at Rice University at the stadium, and that was about going to the moon. But he used some words in that speech that I think relate to our topic for this evening, and I'd like to read them to you so you can recall them as you listen to this speaker this evening. We set sail on this new sea because there is new knowledge to be gained and new rights to be won, and they must be won and used for the progress of all people. For space science, like nuclear science and all technology, has no conscience of its own. Whether it will become a force for good or ill depends on man, and only if the United States occupies a position of preeminence can we help decide whether this new ocean will be a sea of peace or a new terrifying theater of war. I do not say that we should or will go unprotected against a hostile misuse of space any more than we go unprotected against a hostile use of land or sea. But I do say that space can be explored and mastered without feeding the fires of war, without repeating the mistakes that man has made in extending his grid around this globe of ours. I think those words are very appropriate to the speaker's topic this evening, and we're very fortunate to have her with us today. She left in Rhode Island this morning to come down. I think she mentioned it was 14 degrees there, so it's a little warmer here. But Dr. Joan Johnson-Freese is the chair of the Department of National Security Studies at the Naval War College at Newport, Rhode Island. She's served on numerous significant committees, the National Research Council, the Space Studies Board, and a number of other eminent committees. But over and above that, she has authored, I think, some outstanding books on space. Her two most recent ones, Space as a Strategic Asset, she wrote and is very appropriate to the topic this evening, as well as the one that she has just completed and that we have outside for those that are interested in purchasing it. Heavenly Ambitions, America's Quest for Dominance of Space. So I will turn the podium over to Joan Johnson-Freese, and I will have a reception afterwards. And those of you who are interested in purchasing a book, I think Joan would graciously agree to sign them. Joan.
Thank you very much again for coming out in what to me is a lovely evening. This is the first time I've been at Rice University since 1997, when I was here as part of the International Space University, the summer program. I thought it was a lovely campus then, and it's an immensely expanded, it seems, campus now, and still very lovely. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm always impressed by the work that's done here at the Baker Institute, and to be part of it, it's really an honor. So I'd like to talk to you tonight about basically my work over the past 5 years. I've done 2 books in the last 5 years, one in 2007 and one in 2009. And I'm tired. I'm not doing any more for a while. But it's because I felt that Washington has been littered with space policies, many of which we haven't followed, many of which we wrote and then ignored, and the ones that we tended to pay attention to, quite frankly, I thought were going in the wrong direction, and I was very concerned about that. So the 2 books really follow on one to the other, and I'd like to kind of take you on this analytical journey that I've been on and explain why I think it's been in a wrong direction. Unfortunately, the announcement today about Constellation more or less vindicates one of the thoughts I had in the 2007 books, and it's one of those things you hate it when you're right, because it didn't look good then. And quite frankly, I'm not surprised at the cancellation now. I don't see that there was much of an option. But what I did in the second book is pick up on one theme in the first, and that is the weaponization of space. And that's what this second book, Heavenly Ambitions, America's Quest to Dominate Space, is all about. Again, the first book in 2007, Space is a Strategic Asset. You can tell when the publisher picks the title, not the author, can't you? That was not my idea. Basically, deals with a confluence of events as I saw them over a period of about a year and a half that convinced me that the United States was really going in different directions regarding space than much of the rest of the world, and that was setting up the potential for what I called a clash of ambitions. The book, interestingly enough, was translated into Chinese legally by the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and I was invited to go to China last spring and do a book tour there and talk about my book. And it was very interesting to have this dialogue because the Chinese are very interested in what we're doing. They're not quite sure what we're doing, and it was very hard to try and explain it. It was especially difficult when questions would start out like, Dr. Freese, can you explain how your Congress works? You know, and you knew you were fighting a battle because you couldn't explain it in the United States. You sure can't do it in China. And then Heavenly Ambitions came out again last March and really picked up on the weaponization theme that had been started in the 2007 book. I always start by talking about why is space important and some of the difficulties with even answering that question. To me, nobody cares why space is important. It's like your car. Nobody wants to know why your engine works. Nobody wants to have you understand spark plugs. You just want it to work. And people today just want all the information technology and all the benefits of space that we get and we don't even realize to just be there. To have the ATM work because there's computer connections with GPS that make timing signals available. They just want things to be there when they're needed. But it's not always easy. It's GPS I love. It's an example I use over and over and over. Of course, is a space system that's owned and operated by the U.S. military and came very, very close to cancellation because no one in the military could come up with a mission for it. It was something they wanted to have, but that's not the way you fund programs in the military. At least it didn't used to be. You had to designate a mission and say this would be used to fulfill that mission. And nobody quite knew why GPS was going to be needed, but they knew they wanted it. And of course, now it has become one of two global utilities. The internet and GPS are considered two global utilities so valuable to everyone that no one wants to be without it. And that raises some interesting questions. It's not particularly easy to operate. We want it to work all the time. But the example I often cite, and I'm looking at this picture of this Air Force operator flying a desk, as we call it, who mistakenly transmitted a timing error to one GPS satellite in 1996, astutely caught it in less than 6 seconds, and over 100 cell phone networks on the East Coast of the United States went down for over 24 hours because of that one timing error. So the value of GPS to all of us is intense, but none of us really think about it. In the 2007 book, I used the example of the unnamed friend who was testifying before Congress about why a new weather satellite was needed and was going on and on about the value of the data that would be received, et cetera. And the chair of the committee said, but I know you're a scientist. I know you scientists like all this data and everything, but we already have the Weather Channel, so I really don't see the need, you know. So if you're dealing with that level of just give it to me, you know you're starting from kind of behind the power curve. Space is important, especially to the United States, if you just even look at assets, not even usage. Over 800 satellites currently in orbit. Over 400 of them are U.S. assets. So we are the largest users of space. That means that we have the most to lose if space assets are damaged. This points out the number of satellites in very, very rough terms. And if you look at the U.S. numbers, yes, there are about 100 military satellites, but most of the use is civilian. It is a very heavy communications, information. Space assets are a tool of globalization. They provide information technology. And one of the arguments I will make to you is that the rest of the world views space in just that way, as a commons. Space is a global commons in which assets reside that allow you to come up the globalization curve. If you're not part of the global economy, you're left behind. Therefore, if you deny me the right to use space, it is a form of neocolonialism. Quite frankly, it's that simple when presented from their perspective. You will also note China. We're going to talk quite a bit about China in my presentation, and I will try and keep it to a point where we can have dialogue and questions rather than me just talking at you. But please note the difference in the number of assets China has to the United States. China's assets are growing, but so are ours. I wrote an editorial not too long ago that got a lot of buzz, positive and negative, saying we're talking about the U.S. here and China here, and China's coming here, and the U.S. is only going there. Does that difference make a big difference? And I'm saying no, it's relative. China is not catching and superseding and running past the United States in any type of capacity. It's change in difference. So this clash of ambitions, this setup for what happened over this period from October 2003 through August 2004, four events kind of caught my eye as an indication that the U.S. was on this different path than much of the rest of the world. In October 2003, the Chinese launched their first man in space, initiated their human spaceflight program. They had it, it was not the first Shenzhou flight, it was the first manned flight. They had had several previous to test the life support systems and the different systems involved. But this was their first. They became, with the United States and Russia, the only two countries capable of human spaceflight. Well, what does that mean? Does it mean that the Chinese were challenging the U.S. to a space race? Does it mean that they've now superseded the United States in terms of capabilities? Well, it certainly means that they've done something that a lot of other countries aren't able to. If Japan and Europe could send a human into space within their budget, I have no doubt that they would, because you got a lot of good prestige and what we call techno-nationalism. A quote I use from a Chinese political scientist I think sums it up, that through this space launch, the rest of the world now knows that China can do more than produce knockoff designer clothes and sneakers. It will help them sell technology. It shows that they can do more than produce cheap consumer goods. The Chinese are anxious to show themselves as the leaders of the developing world space programs, and they got a lot of very positive play in Asia. Interesting to note that the United States was very curt at best in our congratulations and delayed in our congratulations. There was a lot of speculation, and still is, that the Chinese human spaceflight program is a Trojan horse for military space activities. I had the pleasure this afternoon of speaking with George Abbey, who above all would know, what did the manned space flight in the United States give to the military? And once you get beyond things like computational analysis and materials processing or materials, the direct transfer isn't there. We tried. We looked for it, but we couldn't find it. But apparently the Chinese have. The second event in the same month was that the European Union signs their pact to develop Galileo and include China as a partner. Important for a couple of reasons. Again, these space assets are seen as tools of globalization, so important that many countries of the world, including allies in Europe, don't trust the United States won't turn it off in terms of conflict, and so are willing to commit, though not without great difficulties in Europe, their own resources to building another system. I think that the lack of trust and the need are important. The willingness to include China also demonstrates that while the United States and China in space have, since at least the late 90s, our relationship has been one of kind of scorpions in a bottle. At best, we ignore China. They're just not doing anything. At worst, it's high-level rhetoric of acceptance, with everything below that very highest level being almost confrontational. References as the next near-peer competitor, seeing everything in a kind of nefarious light. So Europe moves forward with China on Galileo. In January 2004, we have the infamous New Vision for Space Exploration that, of course, led to Constellation, which sadly, ironically, is canceled today. Again, I don't see that as particularly surprising. The difference between a vision and a fantasy is a budget. And the one thing the vision never had was an adequate budget, so it's been a fantasy all along that we've, always hoped somebody would pony up that required money, and it's not going to happen, not in these economic times. So sadly, again, I think it's really not surprising. And the last is the issuance of Air Force Doctrine Document 2-2.1, Counterspace Operations. Counterspace operations. What are counterspace operations? They are defined as offensive, defensive operations. You go on the offense for a good defense. It is discussion of the use of space weapons to protect U.S. assets. It's not the first time. In fact, there were documents in 2002 and 2003 which had talked about the U.S. must be able to deny other countries the use of space when required to do so, including the ability to define deny as stop. There are many different ways to do this, but basically it's taking the U.S. down a road where you're trying to defend technology with technology. That makes you constantly on defense. You are in a constant arms race with yourself because, as the discussion I had earlier this afternoon here at Rice, it was very, very astutely put. If you're playing this game of defending space assets, you always want to be on the offensive side. Much easier. If you use military analogies of the high ground, well, in space, satellites aren't the high ground. They're sitting ducks. Bright object against a dark sky, predictable orbit. Very difficult to defend with technology. But this document, you can say, well, it's just an Air Force document. It's not U.S. policy. Well, in 2006, and along the way, it was more or less incorporated into U.S. national space policy. So what I saw happening here was the U.S. going into a space is a battle space mode, while the rest of the world was seeing space as a globalization commons, and that wasn't going to forever endure in a non-confrontational way. The umbrella problem that makes all this very difficult is the conundrum of dual-use technology, which has really two aspects to it: the civil military and the offense-defense. Dual-use technology is any technology that can be used either for civilian or military purposes. And as best I can discern, over 95% of space technology is dual-use. When I teach undergraduate courses, the first thing I ask in connection with this slide is, what's the difference between a rocket and a missile? Well, there are differences, certainly, payload, trajectory, but payload being the key, orbit, but the basic rocket technology used for propulsion into whatever orbit you're going to is largely the same. So one has a very peaceful connotation, the other not so much. There's an interesting, if I can make this work. This is kind of an interesting image here. Anybody hazard a guess at what it is? It's the first image that was allowed into a court of law from a satellite. It's Singapore Harbor. And these are ships, and there was a large oil spill. And of course, every ship captain said, not me. And as it happened, an ESA satellite captured this image, and of course, well, there's the offender right there. You can see the oil spill tracing from it. It was allowed into a court of law, and that ship was required to pay both cleanup and punitive damages. Now, of course, that satellite doesn't know if it's taking an image for crop rotation, legal purposes, or targeting. It's benign. It's application that becomes important. And why have I got the shuttle up there? Because at one time the shuttle was on the Soviet ASAT list, under the idea that it could go into space and just pluck satellites out of orbit, put it in the cargo bay, and bring it back. Well, you believe what you believe, even if it's not particularly true, or easy at least. In terms of differentiating offense and defense, technically speaking, our missile defense system, I have it pointed out to me all over the world, is actually more capable as an ASAT system than a missile defense system. That again, hitting a bullet, with countermeasures being used by your opponent, is much more difficult than targeting a satellite in a predictable orbit. So these two issues complicate everything else that we try and talk about regarding this clashing ambitions. The ambitions of other countries can't be ignored, and they're not all benign. Certainly Galileo, we had a lot of angst about the potential commercial competition that would generate, but working with the Europeans does not give us the same kind of heartburn as when our friend Ahmadinejad starts talking about missiles and space programs, and India has a mature space program which includes not only lunar missions, but now they are talking about the necessity of having an ASAT capability. China is working with everybody. Nigeria, they are working with the Nigerian space program. They are working with every developing country that seems to want help. They are now heading up a Pan-Asian space consortium that, while it hasn't been very active yet, it has the potential. So there are a lot of ambitions to be considered, and China, I think, is the one most relevant, and I'll go into that in more detail in just a moment. In fact, we are all aware of, in fact, the Chinese human spaceflight program, with 95% or more of space technology applicable to military use as well. It's important to note that, yes, the PLA has a very strong presence in its entire space program because the Chinese don't believe in bifurcating their program. They say it's a waste of resources and that all dual uses should be exploited to their full potential. I think we would be naive to think that part of the military modernization that China is undertaking won't include the use of space. On the other hand, there are a lot of noteworthy aspects to the Chinese program that are not necessarily benign. A lot of people point out that their technology looks a lot like Russian technology. Well, the Chinese believe, why reinvent the wheel? If it's a good design, use it. It's not coincidence that one of their launch sites is at the same longitude as Kennedy Space Center. They read AVWeek. It saved them from doing a lot of calculations in their early days. This is a picture I took at one of their space sites, their launch sites, after an explosion, after they had one of their, I think it was the 96, accident, where, interestingly enough, at the time, this launch site is in the middle of nowhere. I was saying the way you get there, you fly to Beijing, then you take a 13-hour overnight train trip where you get off at 5 in the morning with a band playing, get on a bus for 3 hours. It's not the end of the earth, but you can see it from there. And they had 2 gantries. And whereas, of course, at our launch sites, launch control makes sure that if there's any problem, it gets sent to an unpopulated area. Well, at the Chinese launch site, the orders initially were, get it away from the gantry. We only have 2 gantries. Everything else can be replaced. So they blew up their own launch site and the villages around it. And of course, the world was appalled, and the Chinese initially were a little confused. You know, it's different operating procedures. Well, again, we all learn along the way. This is kind of interesting. I was just talking about this earlier. My son and I were walking down the street in Beijing a few years ago, and I saw this. I don't know if you can see, it's a baby's hand holding a rocket. And he speaks Chinese. I said, what does this say? And he looked at it and he said, well, loosely translated, it says, for a better future, use birth control. Space, the connotation of space in China is the future. It's very, very much future looking, you know, which I think is very sad, because in the United States now, if you pick up an elementary school science book, if it's a new one, you might see a picture of the shuttle. If it's an older one, it still might be a Saturn V, and it's taught like a history lesson. In China, it's the future. But of course, this references the 2007 ASAT test, Chinese ASAT test, which they very foolishly, very provocatively conducted an ASAT test which doubled the amount of debris in orbit and put other satellites at risk. It did more for the U.S. missile defense program than anything missile defense advocates had also been able to do any time prior. So this was, to me, what this shows, in many ways, China is, you know, I hate to use the analogy, but like a petulant teenager. It sometimes doesn't know how to act in international relations, in you know, company, and shot off this test for, you know, we can talk motivations if that's an interest to you, because I've got a lot of different speculations. But whatever their motivation, it was irresponsible and did not bode well for cooperative efforts. But then what are U.S. ambitions? One of the things I will say is, you know, if you're reading a newspaper article and they talk about the potential to militarize space, you can stop reading right then. The author doesn't know what they're talking about. The question today is not about militarization of space. Space has been militarized since before NASA. We are talking about crossing the Rubicon into the weaponization of space. While these pictures on the right are only artist renderings, they are renderings that people are talking about. The rods from God, the titanium rods potentially in orbit to come hurling down and have the impact of a nuclear weapon, but without that nasty radiation. People, if we don't take them seriously, I can tell you people in other countries do. Why is the U.S. talking about this if they're not serious? And then in the National Space Policy in 2006, this is a quote from a British newspaper, which basically, again, talks about America wants it all, life, the universe, and everything, where, according to this article, we've declared space the 51st space. Hence my reference to the quest to dominate space. There is a view external to the United States that we want to dominate space, and that language, dominate, the difference between space superiority and space domination is interpreted, and that's the way our language has gone, is interpreted as the way we've been going, and it changes the equation for one where the U.S. space program is far superior to all else, to one where the United States has the ability to deny access to other countries. In terms of militarization, there are 4 basic military space missions: space support, force enhancement, space control, and force application. This is this example I mentioned before of space support. You've got to be able to control your assets. Force enhancement basically talks about the idea of using space assets to improve your chances of success on Earth with military capabilities. It talks about things like command and control, meteorology, using space assets, again, to provide information to troops. You may have heard of Blue Force Tracker used in the Middle East, where our forces would have GPS equipment in their tanks where they could tell which troops were ours and which troops were enemy troops. It was there wasn't enough of it, but what they had was pretty remarkable. The weaponization of space gets into the last two missions. It's an area where we really haven't gone, but we've talked a lot about space control and actual force application. It's been advocated since the 2001 Space Commission chaired by Donald Rumsfeld, and then of course when he became Secretary of Defense it was more or less incorporated into U.S. policy, where it was basically stated that space will inevitably join air, land, and sea as a battle space. Well, if you believe in that inevitability, then you would be remiss not to prepare to defend against it. However, you need to think into second and third order ramifications because, of course, if other countries see us as beginning to do that, they will take measures to try and thwart U.S. ambitions in that area. And that is what I argue is happening right now. Along in the 2001 report, there was also a discussion of the space Pearl Harbor. This gets into a lot of different areas in terms of there are certain Chinese terms, which I will not mangle with my very poor pronunciation, which are translated as assassin's mace. This idea of the space Pearl Harbor as an assassin's mace. The Chinese are trying to find a way to pull a sneak attack, basically. Well, they certainly are looking for, they consider space our Achilles heel because we have become so dependent on space. And in an era of asymmetric warfare, they are certainly looking for ways to thwart that. Whether or not that translates into a secret weapon, my Chinese Mandarin speaker friends tell me that it can also be translated to mean give someone an advantage, whether in a social situation or in war. You know, it's very loosely translated. So the basic premise is that we're going down this path of assuming inevitability and assuming that the way to counter it is with technology, and that the rest of the world is very concerned about that and is in fact not sitting by idly. You know, part of the problem is that the weaponization of space, many people think we already have space weapons, and they're okay with that. I mean, they see it. Nobody listens to scientists. The scientists in the audience, I'm your biggest advocates. I'm out there fighting for you. I want you to know that. Because what you have is images of satellites that kind of hover above Will Smith. Or you have, you know, GoldenEye, and you have, you have all these things that defy the law of physics, but you know, the American public hasn't really been much into science lately. You may have noticed that. And so we have this acceptance of, we probably already have missile defense. As a matter of fact, I cite a 1989 study where 88% of the public that was asked thought we already had a missile defense. And if you ask them today, there was a study done last year, 92% said that they wanted missile defense. Well, my question is, if you ask people, would you rather have a defense against nuclear weapons or not, who would say no? Who's in that 8%? So there's a lot of pop culture that comes into play here that's very difficult to counter. Which leads to the premise of the security dilemma. I'm a political scientist. This is the heart of my argument. This is what I get to. That this fear of exploitation has driven the United States to act in ways that ultimately might not be in our best interest, and is also doing the same to other countries who are responding to us. And we get into this ambiguity of dual-use space technology, which means it's impossible to determine intent. We can tell, we know how many satellites the Chinese have. What they are intending to do with them is another question. I have been asked repeatedly in China, what could we do in space that the United States wouldn't consider threatening? And quite frankly, my answer is not much. Weather satellites, do they benefit the military? Sure, they're force enhancement. Communications, do they benefit the military? Absolutely, command and control. Manned space, well, according to some analysts, yes, they're using manned space to develop spin-off technology. So again, we have put ourselves on this path of defending space technology with more space technology exclusively. I teach at the Naval War College. One of the things I teach is strategy. And we teach the DIME acronym. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. D-I-M-E. Diplomacy, Information, Military, and Economics. The 4 basic tools of policy that policymakers have at their disposal. Well, you know, people argue that of late we've been putting way too much emphasis on the M. And within space, I would argue it's not just on the M, but it's on the technology part of M. We have basically shunned the diplomatic. We have said arms control are not in our benefit in any instance that would restrict us in any way, and we're relying too much on this technology answer. So that puts us constantly on defense. And again, defense is both more expensive and more difficult than offense. We are in a perpetual arms race against ourselves. And then there are questions about the viability of the technology. And not just the physics, you know, whether you have to defy the law of physics or invent unobtainium to make it work, but the economics. It would require a virtual blank check from the American public, which I don't see forthcoming. Oh. So, how to avoid a clash of ambitions? What I argued was that we need a comprehensive space strategy to start with. We have dealt with space in stovepipes. There's the NASA problems. There's the military issues. There's the export control issues. And none of them talk to each other. 20 years ago, I was at a conference in Washington, the Goddard Symposium, and it was to set up a new space symposium, new space strategy for the United States. There wasn't one military person in the room, even though they have over 50% of the space budget. And I asked somebody why, and they gave me an answer that was basically, well, NASA and the military are like pairs figure skaters. They do intricate jumps and turns, but they never speak to each other. You know, and it's been too much like this. We need leadership to say, where are we going with the budget we have in hand? What can we afford to do that we're not going to be fighting each other? And we don't have one, and so it reduces to a security dilemma. A strategy forward. Well, first of all, you know, the United States, we see ourselves as Han Solo, the good guy. But I have to tell you, when the U.S. talks about space, much of the rest of the world hears the voice of Darth Vader. And that's strategic communication. And if there's one thing that a long period in Iraq has taught us, it's the value and importance of strategic communication. What we say and what we do is scrutinized around the world. So what I suggest is to think about this and to go forward with a plan for globalization. Give others a vested interest in protecting assets. I would argue that GPS is probably the safest system in orbit because nobody wants to see it taken down. Give other countries an interest in not having more space debris created so that assets aren't damaged. That we should take a position of leadership rather than competition. And while I mourn the demise of Constellation for what it means to the United States as much as anyone else, I would argue that doesn't mean we have to lose our space leadership. Constellation, in many ways, was a response to the Chinese are going back to the moon, so we have to go too. Why? Well, I don't know, because they're going. We can take a leadership role without this need to race and without this competition spirit. In fact, I would have argued and did argue for many years that we should have been going back to the moon as the leader of an inclusive multilateral effort. We should move away from technology-only protection of space assets. We should use the full DIME tools. And in terms of the security dilemma, I think it's time to start looking at things like rules of the road, much as we have rules of action on the high seas. And they're different during times of peace and different during times of war. But ships passing know how far they should stay away from each other, and if they come closer than that, you can infer nefarious intent. We don't have any such rules in space. Setting them up it wouldn't stop bad guys from doing anything, but at least it would help us identify nefarious intent and be able to decide how we want to respond to it. We need more surveillance. If a satellite went down and the president said what happened, we might or might not be able to give him much information or much fidelity on what happened. We need more eyes in space, and we do need better strategic communication. I think we're beginning to recognize the importance of what we say and the tone we say it in, but we do need to continue to be very aware of, again, this difference between our image of ourselves and others' image of us. One of the examples I use in things that we say and things that we do, certainly the Chinese ASAT test in January 2007 was irresponsible, provocative, foolish, all those bad things. It likely was not a coincidence that it was 2 years later to the day that the Chinese used the same basic technology as a missile defense test. They have been saying for years that our missile defense system was more of an offensive system than a defensive system. They have now just used their corollary technology for both purposes. After the Chinese ASAT test, in Operation Burnt Frost, we used a modified missile defense system to bring down one of our malfunctioning satellites with the hydrazine fuel. You remember that. The headlines after that happened didn't talk about mankind saved from fuel spill. It talked about U.S. now has ASAT capability in the Washington Times and New York Post, or Washington Post and New York Times. And people read that. People read that. That's strategic communication. Space arms control, another message sent that perhaps we didn't intend to send, maybe we did. A lot of words here, but what I'd like to just draw your attention to is that for years, basically, there has been efforts within the UN General Assembly to have a vote in favor of having calling for negotiations towards presenting an arms race. Well, in 2003, 174 nations voted yes, and only 4 countries abstained. That would be the United States, Israel, and those spacefaring nations of Micronesia and the Marshall Islands. In 2005, 160 countries voted in favor of the similar negotiations for preventing an arms race in space resolution. Israel abstained. Now the U.S. voted outright against it. The only country. What is the message that sends? The U.S. position has been space arms control is not in our interest. Repeatedly, we hear the Cold War is over, Mr. President. There is no arms race in space. Again, it sends a message to other countries. Is that really the message we intend to send? So with that, I would conclude by saying I think we are at somewhat of a new era in terms of potential for cooperation. The Obama administration in November 2009, when the president was in China, signed a joint communique with the Chinese in which it was stated that the United States and China would increase cooperation in space science where it has occurred at the scientist-to-scientist level and eventually move towards manned exploration. This is a major shift in policy, major shift. Prior, our policy was we don't work with China. We barely acknowledge their space program. So the door is now open for cooperation and to lead other countries, work with them. I think there's 2 issues, one on each side that will determine what happens next. One is basically there are a number of politicians who don't want to see this happen in the United States, who feel that cooperating with an authoritarian communist government is just wrong and we shouldn't do it. Whether or not that will be the prevailing political view remains to be seen. In China, the Chinese already have an exploration program that's underway. Their science community is not real anxious to put their already established and moving forward program on hold in favor of working with the United States because, quite frankly, they fear that we're not always a real reliable partner and that we're difficult to work with. So there will probably be resistance from the Chinese science community, and we have yet to see if the Chinese politicos will pick up that ball and run with it, or whether they're going to consider it. There are certainly those in China who simply see the United States from a threatening perspective and will resist change as well. So we are at a turning point in many different ways. In the United States, what happened today with Constellation and where the U.S. will go, that still has yet to unfold. Where we will go with weaponization, the Obama administration initially, for a very short period, there was a statement at the White House press site that said the United States will not pursue weapons in space. That was pulled off the website very quickly. So where that will go, we don't know. Whether the Chinese will in fact take advantage of this opportunity to potential work with the United States, or whether they will decide to stay their own course and work on their own, remains to be seen. Whether the hardliners in China will try and thwart these efforts could very well happen. And then, of course, there's always Iran and other countries to worry about. So there's a lot being done, but I do think we are now at a point where we're beginning to expand our options, and that, I believe, can only be to the good. So with that, I'd like to conclude my remarks and open it up to questions and comments.
Thank you, Joan. That was excellent.
Thank you.
Yes.
I have a question, a comment and question. What percentage of all our satellites in outer space are military and which are, just corporate enterprise? And the reason I asked the question is that I was a little confused by what you were trying to say to us about what our stance is in outer space. I mean, from a historical perspective, American assets have been historically gobbled up all over the world in revolutions and wars and things, and we didn't go to war necessarily to protect, Nicaragua maybe was, the banana thing was an exception. But now, are you saying that we have a policy that an attack on a satellite, be it military or corporate, is casus belli, or what is it? What percentage of all these satellites just belong to AT&T and just a bunch of other companies? About
a third of U.S. satellites are owned by the military. But that figure is a little misleading because the military, especially for communications, heavily relies on commercial assets. So the percentage of use is very different than the percentage of ownership. Do we have a policy that if a satellite is attacked, we go to war? Well, first of all, if a satellite goes dead, we probably wouldn't know why. When the Russian satellite collided with the commercial satellite, we knew what happened, but it's not always, that's why I was talking about surveillance, it might not always be clear, why did a satellite go dead? Was it an attack? Was it an accident? Was it a malfunction? If there were a tense moment in the Taiwan Straits and a bunch of satellites went dead all at once, would we get nervous? Probably. Could we tell for sure what happened? Maybe not. Do we have an immediate attack response? I hope not. But I think there would be a lot of confusion, and there would be a tendency, I think, to be concerned, they're trying to blind me, I will blind them in return.
Yes, thank you. I've heard in the report read today that President Obama changed his approach to Constellation. He mentioned that he was looking towards private enterprise to pick up the ball and move forward. How, as a strategist and a military strategist, how does that come into play with your understanding and your thinking when someone else who you don't have control of is picking up the ball for you?
Dependency equals threat in the military world. But, again, it's a difference between relying on commercial satellites for the human spaceflight program and relying on commercial satellites exclusively for military lift. The military likes to keep pretty close hold over what they need for launching assets, but space is such an anomaly in terms of development. It's really difficult. It's a difficult question to answer. You know, usually we use the airline analogy. Airplanes were developed with government money, but then turned over to the private sector. Well, rockets just never quite made it in. They're moving there now, but there's a great deal of trepidation about turning things over to the commercial sector. The problem that I see, and we talked a little bit about this afternoon, there will be no real initiative for development of new capabilities if, in fact, what the current fleet can do what needs to be done. So what you're going to see is a slowdown in advancement. And it's to me, that's unfortunate. You know, we haven't come nearly as far in space travel as we thought we would be by this time. You know, we're not flying around in those flying cars that we were supposed to, or that the Jetsons saw us in. And we're not likely to get there if you are using commercial sector simply to fly government payloads with a flat budget.
Yes.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I was hoping that science and technology would help bring countries together, like you mentioned, the hopeful program with China. So what do you think of the space station? Where does that play to all these equations of militarization and threats?
Good question. For China, being part of the space station has always been the brass ring. They very much want to be involved. When we talk about the family of international spacefaring nations, that's code for space station partners. And they very much want the legitimacy and the credibility of being part of that family. And even though in the United States, the future of the space station still remains to be seen, I think that is one program that, if given the opportunity, the Chinese would join right in. But let me add, too, I think the approach taken by the Obama administration, or it looks like will be taken, that you go slowly. You let the space scientists work together. I love the scientists because their goals are determined by nature as opposed to politicians, and that cleans it up a little bit. Starting there allows us to build knowledge of how other countries work, how the bureaucracy works, what's their legal system, what's their financing system. And George and I had a conversation earlier about you had to learn with the Russians. And now we're going to have to do the same thing with other countries. And I think it's going to be even harder with China. The whole losing face. And when I say maybe, I really mean no. It will take a lot of lessons learned, and I think we can do that. We shouldn't go into anything too fast or anything that we can't follow up on. The last thing you want to do is say, let's go to Mars together by 2015. Oh, well, we really didn't get the budget for that. You need to go slow and be able to follow through.
So building on that, so are the doors open then because of an administration, or is this a trade issue, or is this a money issue, or capabilities, or people? Well,
totally political. This is a change in administration with a change in policy. Whether or not it will be followed up on remains to be seen, because there will still be the same loud voices that have objected for 8 years. They're not gonna tone down.
Well, then if the doors are open and people and let's assume we're working together, then is that creating the rules jointly then apply, or is it going to be a U.S. thing?
Well, it's interesting. I talked about the rules of the road, which has gotten a lot of play lately. The Obama administration has said they are very interested in pursuing this idea of rules of the road, because the United States is just politically, we don't like treaties. We're just, a treaty on whatever. We're not going to sign. But rules of the road is kind of a step towards a treaty. And now you have even the commander of U.S. Strategic Command, General Cartwright, saying, yeah, traffic laws are good. I like that. And when you start getting those kind of voices behind it, and there's an increasing list of individuals who just say, if we just start from do no harm, rules of the road don't do any harm. So I think that's kind of going to be the way of the future.
Do you think not having the Constellation program puts it at a disadvantage strategically in discussing with China? Because we have no way to go into space.
Well, I think, again, there's still a lot of ambiguity of, okay, no Constellation. Give me more, more fidelity. And I don't think we have that fidelity yet. And maybe that's deliberate. I personally think they're trying to hedge their bets. They're trying to see, can we work with China? Is there something they could offer us that would be useful for station? What are our options now? I think all that was basically done was saying the Augustine Commission gave us options. All the ones that include a budget increase, we're not going there. Everything else, I think, is still up in the air.
Crystal ball, we have GPS, we have communications. What else can we expect from the space program, in the near future? I realize there's so many things that it's been good just for the pure science and everything, but what do you see coming relatively soon, the next 5-year out program that will encourage?
Well, I wish I could name a thing, but I think what's going to get a lot of focus will be climate change research and putting money into technology development that might be like GPS. Well, we're not quite sure what we're going to use it for, but right now we aren't really putting a lot of money into, let's see what kind of gee whiz stuff we can come up with. Everything has had to be very focused, and I'm not quite sure what the next thing will be, but I'm hoping that there will just be some investment into what politicians think of as letting you scientists and engineers go play in your heavenly sandbox. Just go invent something cool. Go find something out, because we haven't worked like that lately, and that's when we do our best stuff. So I wish I could be more specific, but that's my best answer on that one.
Any other questions? Sam?
What do you believe the Chinese would bring to the ISS program if they were to be asked?
I think they would say, well, we got a launcher. Can you use it? I don't know, George. Could they use it?
I think we could.
And I don't think it's coincidental that they have a launcher. Some years back. About 10 years back, the Chinese were clamoring, why can't we be in space station? And one of our members of Congress said, okay, all the partners are bringing either money or technology. Which would you like to throw in? And they went away. Well, now they've come back. And I think if you ask them again, they'll say, here's what we can offer. Yeah, technology. Or maybe a good rate on our T-bills. I don't know, So I think that's what it would be.
So how does the U.S. then, if it's cutting back on the program, and I'm guessing cutting back on the budget, some of these programs for development are years or decades or so and require billions of dollars. Who supports that? And where's the guarantee to say, well, this is viable on a commercial basis where I know there's going to be a market and I'm going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on R&D to do so?
The Chinese have basically the equivalent of a DARPA. That it'd be DARPA if it was NASA and DARPA working together. The Chinese have that. And I don't think that's such a bad idea. They basically, that's their idea of all dual use if I invent a widget, I give it to this agency, and this agency's job is to figure out as many uses for that widget as possible. I think that's where you get that kind of investment, where you get that kind of results for the lowest investment. And that means you've got to fund it not out of NASA, but out of NASA, DOD, transportation. This has got to be this is where the leadership comes in. take some money and give it to these people and tell them to go figure out what to use the widget for, or to invent the widget. And then we'll figure out what to do with it. But, you know, you're absolutely right. That's, with the kind of economic situation we have now, you've got to show return. You've got to show return, whether it be in terms of our GPS works better, or we get a new widget. You've got to show return.
Well, we already have a problem as far as having the amount of people to develop it, and then if you cut out the rug,
yeah,
as far as the dollars, you're not really left with much in 10 years.
This is a leadership investment.
Yes.
Was Constellation a bad program or just an underfunded one?
Both. I think it was a program, once the degree of underfunding was realized, you know, once you understand you've got gum and a shoestring, you do what you can. And so was it a bad program? No, it was a program that they hoped they could afford. Would it be the ideal program? No.
But it was also a very different program than the course that we've been on up to this day. We were on a program of international cooperation with space station. Constellation was conceived as a U.S.-only program, which gets back to the point that Joan's been making this evening. And that just raised all kinds of concerns around the world. The Russians wanted to participate in the program. They were told they can't. The Europeans wanted to participate. They were told they can't. Japan wanted to participate. They were told they can't.
So that was if Constellation had been a multinational program with the same basic, goals, it would have
probably been a less expensive program with those nations contributing. And I think that probably this administration wants to see us do things more internationally.
That's the leadership aspect. I concur wholeheartedly. Would it, if NASA was told to sit down and design a return to the moon, go on to Mars, and there's no budget restriction, would they have come up with Constellation? Probably not.
So how do you resolve that with ITAR? With the ITARs?
That's part of the comprehensive. ITAR is part of the broken mechanism. And now, for the first time in years, there is actual discussion of revising ITAR. ITAR are the International Trafficking in Arms Regulations, our export regulations, which were set up during the Cold War when we knew who the enemy was and what we didn't want to sell them, and now still to this day include such items as night goggles sold by LL Bean. But nobody has wanted to be the one to say, okay, take those night goggles off, because then sure enough, that was the sale that propelled the Chinese to outdo us in, but you've got to rationalize ITAR.
There's an excellent report that was turned out by the National Academy last January, Fortress America, which really, I think, outlined why we need to get rid of ITAR. And it recommended to the administration that they just abolish everything completely, because it was doing such damage to this country. Abolish
it and just stay ahead. It goes back to the other, don't worry about their buying last year's widget, just build a better one.
Could you tell us, please, about the evolution of the heavenly ambitions of NASA?
Pardon me?
Heavenly ambitions of NASA?
Well, heavenly ambitions, I think, again, it was part of the idea that if you apply that to NASA, that we must be number one in all fields, and we must do it alone. It's, as Mr. Abbey just said, this idea of we're going to do it all, and we're going to do it alone, and we're going to do it in a way that everybody else is going, why do they feel the need to do it alone? Why can't we work with them? Why the domination aspect? So I think that's the area where NASA got sucked into the domination. But basically, when I'm talking about domination, I'm talking about the weaponization aspect.
But, we, in the face of a very successful International Space Station program, we came up with a Constellation program that was completely going the other way, with no international participation. So it didn't make any sense from that standpoint.
Well, and our partners are just getting their modules up and we're saying, sorry, the bus just broke down and we're taking it out of work.
Which again gets back to our credibility to work with other countries.
Strategic communication.
After we committed to provide the space shuttle to support the station.
Should we have done that?
But isn't that the premise? It must be sold, it must be international, that we need to become international, then the other things start to derive out of that, as opposed to attacking each one of the premises that I've heard, that we need to do this or that or destroy ITAR, which I might agree with, but the big thing is we have to work internationally. If something stands, you have to come up with that premise.
Yes, come up with a single defining premise that is your strategy.
Fall out of that.
Yes, exactly.
That's one of the goals.
Yes.
Without it, I could almost attack every one of your
Absolutely.
premises.
Absolutely.
If I believe that, then the entire architecture becomes, I don't want to use the word vulnerable, I'm a security guy, so I'm using words that will cause misinterpretation of what I'm saying. But you almost have to make that premise. There's an international world. We have to move toward that international world. And then these things become palatable to the security community.
Do you believe that or not?
Yes, I believe that.
I do too, but not everyone does.
A formidable group of people that do not.
Yes.
Otherwise, you wouldn't have these things happening since 2005.
Absolutely.
Not 20 years ago, but recently
Absolutely.
in real time.
Well, I think it's very arrogant to think that we have the technology of the world, because in today's environment, physics and engineering, they know no boundaries.
But isn't that a premise of the American people
people
right now? I heard that earlier, and I think it is. We actually believe that because we haven't seen the trains and the things in other parts.
Well, I think if you look at that report that was done by John Hennessy and Brent Scowcroft, the National Academy report from last January, it makes the case quite clear that we've just completely done a lot of damage to our country.
So if you were going to have that kind of premise, would it be like the Joint Strike Fighter? You had your Tier 1 partners and your Tier 2 partners, and everyone contribute?
Oh, I don't like to use the Joint Strike Fighter as an example for anything good, but
In the case of that fighter, the Prime Minister of Great Britain had to go to the President to get a waiver on ITAR.
Right.
Otherwise, they were going to drop out of the program because we wouldn't cooperate with them,
Right.
even though they were putting money into it.
Yeah. That gets back to the rules of space and the overarching rules that dictate.
what's your premise? What do you want to do? Stop talking about where you're going to go and what you're going to build. What do you want to do? And then the rest will fall out from there. What are your premises?
How much this is policy? How much is this is corporate greed, if nothing else?
Well, you know, missile defense with just a few more billion, I'm pretty sure we can get something with a better than zero chance of maybe working, you know. So is there a follow the money aspect to it? Sure there is. But no, I think it's fundamentally more than that. It's this stovepipe lack of direction, nationalism, lack of trust in science and engineering, and more in Hollywood, and it's those problems.
From the defense attack angle, which is the biggest worry, the assets up in space or being attacked in your own country?
From space, you mean? Yes. Well, you know, again, if you think about assets, attacking assets in space, it's a lot easier to take out the ground station, you know, rather than taking out the satellite. And, you know, we do that all the time. So why are you going to take out the asset? So there's that whole question that remains unanswered. In terms of weapons in space, this is that's the rods from God concept, the titanium rods that would come hurling down. You know, I just can't believe that people psychologically would be real comfortable with that in orbit. With a United States guarantee of trust me, we'll only use it for things like bunker busting. I don't think so. So I don't know that one is more worrisome than the other. They're kind of apples and oranges and both worrisome.
I think trust is
Pardon?
Trust is the key word.
Trust is the key word. Confidence building measures, yeah. But they take time. They're like sanctions. They take time, so nobody's comfortable with that.
Yeah, I don't think that type of a weapon was any more meaningful than like a small diameter bomb. I mean, smart bombs are just as terrifying as those are, I guess they're just not as menacing as a look as a satellite in space, or?
I don't know. I've given up trying to predict what the American public or any public will accept or not accept.
I mean, cost-wise, I mean, there's a lot more.
Well, also, there's...
We're flying everybody around the world all the time.
Yeah.
So people get much more uncomfortable with it as opposed to a smartphone.
Well, and also, many of the studies show that if, in fact, you dropped one of those rods, it would take it longer to get to its target on Earth than had you just fired something from Earth to its destination.
Right, I guess that was my point.
Yeah.
Just
so why are you going to do it? That's what other countries say. So why are they doing it? There's clearly got to be more to this.
Oh, why are we doing that, though?
Yeah, why are we even thinking of that? What is the United States, why are they even thinking of that if they can do it cheaper, easier, faster, and more effectively ground to ground?
I see.
Yes.
As the law currently stands, can U.S. Companies like SpaceX launch payloads belonging to other countries? If they, like India, wanted to have communication satellites, can they just purchase from a U.S. company the launch services?
Under ITAR, most of the world doesn't want to launch on U.S. launch vehicles because of the ITAR rules. So the U.S. ability to launch commercial payloads with their launch vehicles is if you look at the launch vehicles in the United States, the only thing they're launching is government payloads.
One of the French companies, that's one of their slogans, ITAR free.
Well, we have a reception out in the foyer here, so will we end the question?
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your questions and your comments. And please feel free to contact me back at the War College if you have any questions or anything further to discuss.
And there are some books that Heavenly Ambition has produced, which they will have here.
I will.